It says I can put up with this thing because at some point it's going to go away. I don't have to deal with it any longer. Or that when I get tired of dealing with it, I can just stop. I don't have to, right? So when we talk about this idea that organizations are tolerant of racial or cultural differences, in and of itself, this idea of tolerance is problematic, because it certainly sets up a paradigm that says at some point I don't have to do it, whether either those people will leave or I will just not do it as a part of my protest, or I'm just tired of doing it. And people will say things like, I am tired of talking about diversity. Have you ever heard somebody say that? It's usually people who have a luxury not to talk about it. They get tired of it, right? And I was doing a thing with a university, and I was a little hard on this cat because he thought, well, I was just hard on him because he needed somebody to be hard on him. And he said, Andre, I'm tired of, he was from Ghana. And he said, why am I always the one who has to talk about these diversity topics? And why do I have to be the one who, people always ask these questions? And I told him, I said, well, you don't have to be. You don't have to be the one, because you don't have to answer. I said, but people keep coming to you because there's something about you that they feel you might have the answers. And I said, if you don't speak up and they keep coming to you, can you be guaranteed that somebody else will? And he said, no, I can't be guaranteed. So I said, shut up. Quit belly aching. Understand that this is your responsibility to do this in that particular context at that particular time, because there are other people who look similar to you, who don't know how to. People don't go to. People don't have that expectation of coming to answer or ask those questions. So for those of us who have that responsibility, although we get tired, it should have nothing to do with the fact that we understand that that's our responsibility to do that. So when we start talking about organizations moving from this idea of multicultural to anti-racist, what we start to recognize is that there's symbolic change that happens in the organization, right? So some of that symbolic change, so first of all, in the multicultural kind of organizations, people are looking at those checklists and checking those boxes so that they don't what?
Look racist.
So they don't look racist, or they don't get in trouble, right? So we'll check those boxes and make sure that we have it's funny, I worked for an organization, and there is a percentage of, there's a percentage that there's a ratio, a legal ratio for what women and men should be making in terms of compensation. There's a ratio. And if you go beneath the ratio, then you are subject to some federal fines and some federal backlash and that kind of stuff. You certainly can go over the ratio and do a 100% match. But this particular organization wanted to do the minimum of what they had to pay. The minimum maximum is the kinds of languages they use. So they wanted to pay women the most they could without actually making it an equal thing. It was just the most interesting budgetary thing I could ever, I couldn't imagine that, right? So these symbolic things happen in organizations. So they make official policies pronouncing they're regarding diversity. So they say, we're a diverse organization. We're supportive. We have diversity clubs. We have, caucus groups and that kind of stuff. But what do we fail to see? Although they're espousing these values, what do we fail to see? Proof, right? So in this early organization that is talking about tolerance, there's very little proof in seeing what they're doing, although they're espousing these things. They carry out intentional inclusive efforts. They have someone of color on committees and other staffings. They're expanding the view of diversity, which includes all these other things, right? But they don't want people to make waves. We don't want to change it too much, particularly when we're in the symbolic change, right? So I worked for another organization, and one of the things that we talked about, I said, you know, right now the organization looks a particular kind of way because we have a certain set of policies. And so I suggested that another policy, that if we want to change the nature of how the organization looks, a policy that we should deal with, or we should talk about or implement, was something referred to as a nepotism policy. That as an organization, maybe it might be helpful to diversify our organization if grandfathers weren't supervising their grandchildren, or if husbands and wives weren't supervising each other. That might help with some diversity stuff. Or that you know, parents and children aren't working in the same department or even in the same company, in the sense that they could, you know, be influencing things in the organization. And the organization that I was working with was, it was suggested that that's not a can of worms that I want to open or deal with. What does it tell someone about the organization?
They want it that way.
Yeah, right? Say that again?
Closed-minded.
Yeah, they're closed-minded, that they want it that way, that they're really not, but they want the symbols of change, but they don't want authentic systemic change. And then stage 4 is this idea of identity change as an anti-racist institution. For institutions, and even for ourselves, to recognize that we are immersed in a racist social structure. To say, we have to be able to at least say those words to ourselves, that I am in a system that was partly founded on, as well as consistently condones these racist notions. I mean, the thing with Judge Scalia saying those things, right? That's based on racist notions of inferiority and superiority. And hopefully you read through the packet and you could see some of those things come up in history, right? So this whole idea of the bell curve and all this kind of stuff. Judge Scalia is a student of that particular time and may have those same kinds of thoughts. But it requires us to identify that and to say that I am a person who will fight against these ideas of race and racism. And so there's once people are able to change that identity and at least identify that they're willing to work against the system of racism, then there's a growing understanding of racism as a barrier to effective diversity. People can then develop an analysis of systemic racism, and they can see systemic racism, right? There's a new consciousness of institutionalized white power and privilege, and why does our institution look the way it does? I find it interesting that people will oftentimes in organizations ask, why can't we get more people of color into this organization? Or why don't people of color stay in this organization? But they never ask, why do we have so many white people in our organization? And how are we able to keep white people in our organization, right? Once we spin that way of thinking, then we can start looking at some of the systems that keep our organizations looking the way many of them started, right? And so by flipping that question, so why are there so many white people here? Oh, they feel comfortable. Oh, why do they feel comfortable? What about our environment is comfortable for them that could be exclusive to other people? I want to say I am not suggesting that that white people should not have access to goods, jobs, services, and money in a way that is comfortable for them. But I am suggesting for those organizations and those individuals who say that they want to be diverse, these are some of the considerations one has to have if you want to create those diverse outcomes. If you want to be reach multicultural clients and institutions, these are some considerations that you have to have. So that's that. There's a new consciousness of institutionalized white privilege and power. We just talked about that. We start to develop an identity around fighting the system of racism, and we have to name those things specifically. Diversity does not necessarily do that, right? Did I show you this diagram for diversity? We did this diagram, right? Right, so same and different, right? And diversity doesn't make anything in and of itself. It is about, it's about the numbers, it's about the what, it's about the people, it's all those types of things, right? And so then we get into this idea of being an anti-racist multicultural organization. Racial and cultural differences seen as assets, right? So up until this point, we've been talking about multiculturalism as if it were a problem to be dealt with. Under monocultural organizations, they see differences as a problem to not recognize. Multicultural to anti-racist movement in an organization is to see it as something that needs to be managed. And as we move into anti-racist institutions, we see differences as assets for growth and development in our organization, right? And so we start asking questions about who helps make decisions when we become an anti-racist, who's missing when we are making decisions, who needs to be added to make sure that we have the kinds of things that we want, and what is our recipe? What's our mix? What are we trying to get at by having these conversations or engaging folks from all of our cultural aspects? What are we trying to gain from that? And so we look at a strengths-based approach as opposed to a deficit approach. And so those earlier stages are really deficit focused, where these last two stages of looking at structural change and full inclusivity are really looking at strength-based approaches to our organizations and developing that cultural continuum of what some folks might even call cultural competence, so that folks can feel included in the organization. So if you turn to the next page, I just want to go over a few vocabulary pieces. And have people read over this vocabulary stuff at all? Yes, no, okay. So anti-Semitism is a relatively familiar phrase, word, yes, okay. Apartheid, bigotry, blockbusting. Are people familiar with that term? Blockbusting, okay. So blockbusting was striking fear, particularly into white people's hearts, that that other racial groups were going to come and mess up their neighborhood. So sell now while you can get top dollar, as opposed to later when those people come and destroy your neighborhood. And that was kind of a de facto piece of what the housing market had to, the way the housing market was working, right? So they also had a concept in here called redlining, but we can talk about that. The idea of civil rights, demagogue is a person who gains power through impassioned public appeals to the emotions and prejudices of a group, speaking and or writing. Who currently is this person? And yeah, so folks like Bill O'Reilly or Trump, or I'm trying to think of folks on the left that fit a bill like that. There used to be a radio station called American something, and they had a lot of pundits on there on the left that would talk very similar to the folks on the right. Ethnocentrism, the belief that one's own culture or religious or political group is superior to all others, right? So ethno, the root word is centrism, or where we get the word center, right? So your ethnic group is the center. Idea of genocide, gerrymandering, which is reorganizing of political districts and that kind of stuff based on, they say it's based on demographic shifts and so forth and so on. Sometimes that's not necessarily the case. This idea of ghetto, and I think this is an interesting concept, because it's a section of the city which Jews are required to live surrounded by walls, has been adopted to include sections or cities predominantly inhabited by minority groups, which may have socioeconomic rather than physical barriers, right? And so you'll often hear people say, well, that was so ghetto. Well, what they're saying is that there's something lesser about that person's whatever it is than some other folks. So here's a key word that it certainly has been important to me in hegemony. And hegemony is a system that is designed to benefit the creator, right? And so when we look at, so I prefer talking about hegemony than I do white privilege, because people will talk about this idea of white privilege. And I find white privilege a little bit complicated and problematic, because there are white people who have not experienced, or they don't believe that they've experienced, this idea of privilege. But what I will say is that there is a hegemony that is operating, and it's designed to benefit those who created it, as well as those who buy into what those people created, right? So, for example, we can talk about this idea of whiteness, but not every white person built this idea of whiteness. But the ones who buy into it, because who built this idea of whiteness? Was it all white people? Because were all white people white at the same time? No. So who built the system of this, with this white consciousness as a dominant?
Like colonial generation of America.
So the colonial generation, right? So who colonized? So Europe and England. So the common people say, we're going to go over there and start a colony. Did common everyday folks say, we're going to take our little meager resources and go over there and start a colony?
No, that's what we were talking about the other day, that it was companies.
Right? So it was companies, it was kingdoms, it was kings, it's queens, so it's the owning power who has set up the system, and who benefits from that? They do. And people who believe in what they believe benefit from that as well. Right? So part of the thing that sagging, and I don't know why I'm sticking on sagging pants, but the sagging pants thing is very interesting, because it flies in the face of the system that other people set up. And so it's unnerving to people to do that. And we also know that, particularly with young people, if I can do anything that is unnerving, that's cool, right? You know, the Beatles mop top, where their hair came all the, right? That was unnerving to people. And young people loved it. They were like, oh, I'm going to do the same thing, you know? So that's important. The Holocaust is important to recognize. Insurance redlining. And I think we'll watch a piece tonight on this. It's the practice, and it's currently illegal, but was not illegal in the past, illegal in many states, of setting insurance rates based on the basis of a neighborhood, which is intended to discriminate against residences and businesses in undesirable neighborhoods. And undesirable is in quotations, because undesirable is also another word for multiracial neighborhoods, or black neighborhoods, or minority dominated neighborhoods, undesirable. So the Ku Klux Klan, we know what that is, this idea of lynching. So pogrom and organized or often government-sponsored condoned massacre of Jews. Prejudice is a thought process. We've kind of talked about that. Propaganda. Racism is a hegemony based on the constructed hierarchy of race. Belief that one race is superior to another. This idea of scapegoat, so forth and so on. Other important terms: affirmative action, a plan that focuses on hiring, training, and promoting individuals in protected classes. And that's a key word, protected classes, because there are other groups that aren't protected classes. And when we say protected, we mean under law. So right now, if I am obese, morbidly obese, as you know, as my WE says that I am, right? There are certain protections, but there is no specific protection for being obese, right? Depending on my obesity, if I have some challenges that don't allow me to do what other people are able to do on a regular basis, it would be considered a disability. So then the ADA would kick in. Or if I'm female, the protections of, you know, the 1964 Civil Rights Act may start kicking in, but there is no specific thing around obesity. So there are lots of things, and so people who are either two-spirited or people who may be trans, there aren't specific protections under the law for those particular states of being. However, there are protections that can be applied. And so folks are trying to add to this list of protected classes on a regular basis, but it's ultimately the Supreme Court that will rule on how those things get added or don't get added, and that kind of thing. So affirmative action programs are all those things that try to fulfill that affirmative action. This idea of diversity, we've kind of talked about. The rest of that stuff you can read at your convenience. The idea of, I did want to flip over one in talking about this idea of assimilation. And assimilation is very interesting because it requires someone to take on the characteristics of the dominant culture. And some of that stuff is going to happen, right? So there's this idea of, and I think we talked about this idea of cultural appropriation. Have you heard that term before, right? So some of that idea of cultural appropriation is that people will take on the characters of the places that they are. And part of that is just natural, right? So, I'm in France and I learned some French. I do some French things. That's natural for the environment that I'm in. What assimilation suggests is that people have to diminish who they are to become more of who the dominant group is. The other thing about this idea of cultural appropriation is that I like to separate cultural appropriation from this idea of cultural misappropriation. So there are certain things that I pick up that either I assimilate to or I culturally appropriate. I take those things and use them because I'm in that particular context. And then there are things that I take from another culture that I have no relationship with. And I take them because it pleases me to do so, right? So I'm trying to think of an example that would play out. Oh, so The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, right? Beautiful tattoo on his arm. Absolutely beautiful, right? Dude is buff. I mean, and I don't know how I think he's on something because I don't know that you can get older and get buffer, right? Like, I don't understand how that happens. But at any rate, so, well, I guess if you get paid to work out, that's a whole nother thing, right? Yeah. At any rate, so he's got this beautiful tattoo on his arm, and I saw a dude who had the same tattoo on his arm. What was the challenge with this guy having the same tattoo that Dwayne Johnson had?
Why does he have it?
Why does he have it?
Because Dwayne
Because Dwayne Johnson
Johnson has it?
has it? Maybe I don't know. What's so special or important to know about Dwayne Johnson's tattoo?
It's from his Samoan heritage.
Because he's Samoan. It's a Samoan tattoo. It tells a story about being Samoan on his arm. The dude that was on Pinterest that had the same one was not Samoan. Right? So he took something from another culture and applied it to himself without having a relationship or unnecessary. And I don't know if he knows that that's a thing, but it doesn't look like he knows because it would be a different thing if it was a different tattoo that said something different. But it looks just like the one Dwayne Johnson has, right? You'll also see, and it's interesting. I've been looking for European cultures who enlarge their earlobes and, other piercing pieces as a part of their culture. And I'm not the best anthropologist. I'm a hack at best, right? But I don't know that there are many European cultures where that is a standard practice of enlarging your earlobes or your lip, right? I know that piercing is pretty common in European cultures, but this idea of enlarging. And so I wonder where that comes from. And I have a suspicion that people are culturally appropriating other things to try to speak to the world about who they think that they are or should be or want to be. Go ahead, you were going to say something.
I guess I just was curious to get your opinion on, like, when you see somebody do that, that's trying to emulate their hero or whatever, this guy that has the Rock tattoo. I don't know. I guess the opposite of that, like, if there's somebody who like thinks it's, disturbing or wrong to like enlarge your earlobe. Like, is that, I guess it's a dumb question, but I mean,
No,
are they
it's-
both pretty, is that person considered racist then, if they're like kind of, or prejudice, or?
Yes. So it's a really it's a really complicated piece, because I don't know that I use any of those words when I describe that, right? So what I know is that when I see an artifact, I know it's directly attached to a value, right? So part of what so the way that I interact with that person is I want to find out what that value is for the artifact that I see, right? So I see a kid with enlarged earlobes. I'm just curious.
With an assumption that it might be different for every person you ask.
With an assumption that it might be different for every person that I ask, and I don't know what they mean by what the
Right.
artifact is.
Right.
So I could make an assumption about what that means for them. But if I'm in a counseling situation, if I'm in a caring situation, if I'm in a helpful situation, I can't make assumptions about this artifact. I have to ask questions to find out what that artifact really means to them, right? So your question was, would they be deemed racist or insensitive and that kind of thing? What I would suggest is that those individuals, if they don't understand, they are misguided at best. At worst, they could be those things, right? So, and I would say those types of words start kicking in when people know and don't care, right? So I become, racist or whatever when I know that I've done something, but I don't care, right? But if I've done something and I have a particular set of values that have attached to that, then that's something different, misguided. Now, one of the things we do know about this process is if these two things become disjointed, I still have these values. So now I'm looking for artifacts that demonstrate my values. And that's where that cultural appropriation stuff starts coming in, right? So I'm going to take those values because I value this, but I don't know how to express that. So let me grab this, and this, put this together, and then that's how I demonstrate my values. Go ahead.
Is there a way to be respectful of like another culture?
And appropriate their stuff.
And yeah, but you or one would feel like disgusted by it at the same time. You know what I mean? Like, is that just like an oxymoron? That's just not possible? Or?
No. So can I be respectful of a culture and still use their stuff?
Or even
Is your
just
question.
like, or just not even use it. Like people that just like, no, that would
That's
never.
yours, but it's awesome.
Yeah, like, or I'm just thinking of an example, like, I don't know the name of the tribe or where even in Africa, but like, I'm thinking of a culture in Africa where like they put rings around their neck to
Yep.
elongate their neck.
Yep.
Is it even possible to be respectful of it, of like what they're doing and understanding it, but yet you're like, I would never do that. That's just like,
Yeah. No, I think that.
that's disturbing.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense, right? So part of the thing that we need to be mindful of as human beings, right, is we have the primal brain, the reptilian brain, which has all these primal instincts, and the primal brain says good, bad, danger, friendly, right? I mean, it's not real complex kind of stuff. And that's the first thing that comes up, right? Danger, safety, good, bad, black, white, absolutes kinds of stuff. But then at some point, our prefrontal cortex has to come in, because that's the sapien part of us, right? That the prefrontal cortex comes in and says, let me look at this rationally, because my reptilian brain has already told me danger or, safety. So no, I can certainly say it's a critical mind, and I would even say an effective mind that can hold two opposing thoughts simultaneously while as a tool to try to understand what's going on, right? So there are people who put hooks in their backs and they swing because that's their spiritual thing. That's not my thing. I don't have to try that. But as long as it's not illegal where we are, and it's not hurtful to the people who have chosen to participate in that willingly, swing on. But I don't have to, if you ask me for money to fundraise for that, no, I'm not contributing to that. You ask me to put my child through that? No, I'm not, no, I don't have to do that, right? Give me something specific, because it looks like you're looking at something specific.
No, that answers my question. It just seems like there's like a fine line between kind of defining that and letting a culture be, but yet not letting it assimilate to. I mean, I guess I don't know what the gray area is.
Yeah, so let me do this. This is real practical and real, and something we will face and have to deal with, right? So in the Hmong culture, there is a culture of marrying girls off young, like teens. And typically, teens being married to an older man, significantly older, sometimes 20, 30 years older than the young lady. In Liberian cultures, and even in East African cultures, there are cultures where polygamy is a part of what they do, right? That's cool, sorta, where they come from. That's not cool here. It's illegal here, right? So for us to say that something is cultural when it flies in the face of the things that we in our country have deemed as important and legal and some of the principal foundations of our society that we've built, then those things have to be dealt with and talked about in the context of where we are, right? So again, knowing that artifacts demonstrate values, and these values are to try to secure safety, significance, and belonging. We have to address those things, particularly with those things in mind. So no, it's not, in the United States, it's not okay to marry for an older man to marry a 13-year-old girl. It's not legal for a 13-year-old girl to get married at all, right? So to the age of 18, and then they can make those decisions and whatnot. But yeah, so there are some things that are deemed cultural. For example, in African American cultures, people talk about spanking their kids with all types of objects, right? And it gets deemed as being cultural, when in fact abuse is abuse, and there's some sophisticated ways to talk about how and why those things became cultural. But the fact is that the culture doesn't meet our current day times in terms of that stuff. So when we're talking about this idea of being multicultural, what we're talking about is creating spaces for people to be in ways that they were limited before, but we don't have to accept or believe or take everything. And as counselors and therapists, that's not our job. Our job isn't to decide what to take or what not to take. Our job is to help people navigate through questioning, through research in their own environment, what their goals are, and if their current behaviors are helping them to reach their goal. And the way that we have to do that for each culture may be unique and different. Just like the way I approach these circles might have to be unique and different than I approach these circles, right? But I do have to approach them in such a way that we start dealing with core root issues and not just let culture be the blanket that we accept all types of behavior, even when it's not helping them reach their goal. So there's certain things about, so-called Black culture that is cultural, so-called cultural, that I can't support or be a part of because it doesn't help me reach my goals, right? So, and many of those things are stereotypes that get played out by the mass media in the first place. So, so I can't succumb to those things. It was a long way to answer that. I hope.
No, yeah, it's good. I just thinking, when you ask the question kind of being in a class of like, how are you demonstrating this, or how are you thinking critically in your real life? And I guess there was a situation that kind of came up. So I'm a para at Hopkins High School, and there it's a melting pot. They have
all sorts of kids
which
there.
Is great.
Yeah.
And so there's a population of students that are a part of Islam or believe in Islam or Muslim, and so there's kind of a place where they can pray, just a designated place. And a person of color came up to me and asked, like, how is that fair if they can kind of follow, or they can proceed with their faith without any kind of roadblock necessarily, whereas like a person of another faith, it might be looked upon as like, oh, you can't do that in school. I didn't really know how to answer it. I just didn't. I just kind of was froze. And I'm not trying to get hit all the hot buttons here, but it was just something I had to face. And
it's going to keep coming up until we get answers for that, right? And here's the answer.
You can. Why can't you?
What is
you're
it
right.
you're trying to do that you think they get preferential treatment?
Yeah. So first I'd ask the kid questions themselves, right? So they can be clear about what it is that they want to do. Because sometimes, kids, they just want to be obstinate. And not that they just want to be obstinate, but obstinance is how we perceive how they're trying to figure out what's just and unjust, right? And so so the kid is trying to figure that out. So I would work with the kid and go through those questions. Don't take it on because it's not necessarily for you to answer. But I asked them more questions. So who said that you couldn't demonstrate your faith? Is it, who said that? Who pointed that out to you? Because typically what people will say is that I can't express that, but they'll never say who told them they couldn't. Or they haven't read it in any manual because it doesn't exist. So they can do it. They just haven't done it or haven't chosen to do it. But that's a whole nother conversation too, right? So, and then asking questions, well, do you think you're missing out on something by not being able to do that? So let's talk about that. So really walk them through their processes and not get hung up on our stuff as we're trying to work through that, because then we can go work on our stuff in a class like this and ask questions and work it out together, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that if one group can do that, other groups can do it as well. So it's not any different, right? And to be quite honest, for those people who are devout in their faith, just like for Muslim students, it's a lifestyle. For people who are devout in their faith, it is also a lifestyle. It is cultural as well. And so those are conversations that people need to start having. Yeah, why haven't you taken advantage of it? You can do that too. Why haven't you? Or would you take advantage of that if you had the opportunity? Or blah 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 blah. Yeah. So people get hung up sometimes on lots of stuff that they don't have to get hung up on, and usually, particularly with teens, they're looking for. They believe, because we've taught them this, that the world is a just place and that equality is important and fairness and blah, 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 blah. So they're looking for that in every aspect of the things that we do. And so the first thing I would do is just toss it back to them and say, do you think you're missing out on something? Or have you taken advantage of that? Or what does that mean? What do you think that says about our school environment? Or what do you think you could do about that if that's something, blah, 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 blah. Help them problem solve that stuff. Because you can't necessarily answer it for them.
Yeah.
One of that issue came up here. There's some students who wanted to pray, and they were finding corners of the building to pray. And I said, that's inappropriate as an institution for them to be relegated to finding corners off in, somewhere to pray. And so we started talking about some dedicated space for all people to meditate, get their heads together, pray, something that quiet space for them to get focused. And I'm not sure if people are taking advantage of that or not, but I hope that they are. So yeah, so there's that. Cool. Any other things that have come up for you guys? And
Well, what's funny is I don't think of cultural appropriation on such like existential, real big issue terms. I think of it like blackface parties
yeah,
and white people rapping and